Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. I look out in this audience, I know about 2/3 of you. I think it's probably from an old 12-step program we participated in together. We've been through this. Welcome. Delighted to have you all here. First, we always do this as a little safety thing before when we have public events. I'm sorry that we live in an era where we need to do this. If we do have any kind of a problem, I'm your responsible safety officer, so I'd ask you to follow my instructions. Our exit is right here, and it's 10 feet from the stairs that takes us down to the alley. If the problem's in the front, we're going to go to the back, and we'll meet over across at National Geographic. If the problem's in the back, we're going to go out front, and we're going to go over down to St. Matthews. We have arrangements with both of them and mutual support if ever there's an emergency. We won't have any problems, I assure you of that, although this is a pretty dangerous panel, I would say. First of all, I'd like to say sincere thanks to UTC for making possible this series. We are trying to open up a lot of the deep arcana of government that really matters and makes a difference. It's not the sort of thing that's going to be on the front page of the Washington Post, but it is the sort of thing that shapes the daily activity of Washington. And very few people really understand a lot of it, and so part of it's to shine a light. I have a particular interest in this topic. I was on the Hill, Sean and I were on the Hill at the time that these procedures were first outlined, and it was done for a very important purpose. Prior to that time, without an explicit delineation of how protests could be lodged, it tended to gravitate towards politics. And that's not a good answer when you're looking for maintaining the integrity of an acquisition system. And so what was created was a very, very important instrument, and it's very important today. But I'd also have to say, I can't tell you the number of times I talk with people who say, well, we won the contract, but it's been held up because the incumbent, is protesting, and they're going to get another 9 months worth of work at my expense. And I did a lot of heads nodding in the audience, I mean, this sadly is a bit of what we have going on. We do need a system like this. There's no question about it. But we need a system like this that's efficient and fair. And there are real questions in my mind about whether we ought to fine-tune this instrument to make it fair. And I think that's what I hope we get into today. I think it's going to be a very good discussion. A lot of it will depend on your questions, and I hope you'll be very active in working with this panel. Andrew, let me turn to you, and let's get this thing started for real. But just say thanks to all of you for coming. I'm really grateful that you're here. Thank you. You get started, Andrew.
All right. Thank you, John. Well, I want to start by just saying I'm imagining, I'm not going to do a survey, but I'm imagining there are 1 or 2 lawyers in the audience. And so I'm going to begin by saying that CSIS takes no liability for any of the statements that are going to be uttered today. But I can say with great satisfaction that we have an amazing panel put together to talk about this issue, people with deep expertise and experience. So I'm going to do less talking than normal and let them do more talking because that's going to be to your benefit. As John mentioned, I am looking very much forward to getting the audience involved with questions, and we'll do that as we get into the later stages. I do want to recognize, as John did, our sponsor, United Technologies Corporation, which has sponsored this whole series that we call the Next Generation Dialogue on Industry and Defense. We've been engaged in that now for almost a year, had a great discussion focused on globalization. About a year ago, with Bill Lynn as the main speaker, Wes Bush talked about rethinking R&D. We had an event with Dave Melcher on the effects of the budget caps on defense industry. We had a great event with Pierre Chow on the competition for capital in the national security sector. We had another very lawyer-friendly event on the implications or the effects of False Claims Act on the acquisition system. And so today's event, I think, will highlight another important, as John said, sort of systemic issue in the acquisition system that does get attention from time to time, mostly when major contracts are protested and then when those protests are resolved. And we've obviously had a couple of those recently with the Long-Range Strike Bomber and the JLTV contracts. And there's another major protest still pending on the amphibious combat vehicle for the Marine Corps. We won't get into specific pending protest in today's discussion, but it's the systemic effects. And there's really two major aspects in my mind of these systemic effects. One is the one that I think gets a little more attention and discussion, and it certainly merits discussion, which is the direct effect, which is the filing of protests, the outcome of protests, and the length of time spent resolving protests. So those are the direct effects. They're very visible. You can count them. You can count the number of days that it takes the protest to be resolved. And you can count the number of decisions that are sustain the protest or that overturn a contract award. And so we spent a lot of time talking about those issues, and they merit being discussed because there's not consensus on those issues, and we will discuss them today. There's also what I'm going to call the indirect effects of the bid protest mechanism, and that is how it shapes the way that the Department of Defense approaches acquisition and the way that it affects how industry approaches acquisition, because there's important effects on both sides. And you see this in the way that acquisition strategies are formulated. There has been some suggestion, maybe we'll talk about it, that maybe one of the factors that has led to the use of LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable, is that there may be a perception that this is a mode of competition that is, if not protest-proof, easier to handle in a protest environment. It can affect how requirements are stated, in the sense that the more objective the requirement is, I think logically, the easier it may be to deal with protests on that requirement. The evaluation criteria, how then the proposals are assessed. That is, I know that the folks who do that work are thinking about the potential protests as they set the evaluation criteria. The question of who wins. Is it harder for the higher bidder to win in an environment where people are thinking about bid protest and the possibilities? So with that, just that framing, that those are the issues that we want to talk about today and focus on the systemic effects of bid protest and not so much individual cases, I'm going to turn to our panel and let them actually inform and educate you. And we're going to go left to right, starting, and I'll recognize each of them to give a few remarks. And I think what I'll do is introduce them, let them talk, and then we'll move to the next panelists. So first on our list is Sean O'Keefe. Really almost needs no introduction. He has been outed up front as a former Hill staffer, which is, it's okay, you've moved on. As a former Hill staffer myself, I could say you've come a long way, and that's well-deserved. He has been the administrator of NASA, served in both as the comptroller of the Air Force, I believe it was.
Defense Department.
And of the Department of Defense, or did I?
Of Defense only.
Sorry,
Predecessor as the controller.
Excuse me.
Yep.
And has held also senior positions in industry, certainly as CEO of EADS North America at one time. So without further ado, Sean, please kick us off.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Appreciate the invitation to participate in this. This is an important issue, and I think as John framed the discussion at the very beginning, the intent, I think, of trying to formulate a more structured process, an understandable pathway, if you will, to remedy of any grievance, an appellate process in the bid protest procedures was the original intent. And there were any number of issues that cropped up certainly back in the 70s and again very intently in the 80s as well that formulated the body of statutory construction, if you will, and legal interpretation promulgated from Capitol Hill that would attempt to clarify that. And in the name of equity and fairness, the approach was to try to structure that kind of procedure to, I think as he very directly suggested in his opening comments, remove even the suggestion of a political determination as to why the award was made the way it was. A noble objective, but in a process where ultimately it is a public proceeding in which the rules, the structure, the requirements, and so forth are often subject to that interpretation of not only what its broader national focus or imperative should be, but also that of where it's built and where the districts are affected and who sees the result of that and employment consequences and everything else that go with it. This is a completely understandable argument. You can see how it all emerges. And as a consequence, this was an attempt to tighten up the procedures so that it would be less susceptible to broader interpretation in that regard. I think as a general proposition, if you take it just strictly from the standpoint of has it assured appellate process that is more coherently described, the answer is yes. Now, the consequence of that, though, the impact, is quite profound. And I think Andrew touched on that very succinctly here in his opening comments. It has had two results, and I'm going to speak a little bit to the question of exactly how the structure was affected as it pertains to industry behavior too. And there is a rather profound impact in that regard as well. But the consequences that have over time accreted as a result of this is not only the time expended in order to file the protest, then in turn adjudicate that process, and again, all of the head nodding responses to Andrew's characterization of those that are seeking a longer term determination of exactly how this would work versus those who are anxious for an statement of the specific award that had been made so that they could benefit by it. Both ends are not particularly happy with the result, that's for sure. And it takes a long time. There's no doubt about it. This is a process that it becomes so much more evident moving through it, that it's underway, that it draws all the public attention that goes with that. And GAO is not particularly anxious to be accused of anything other than completely playing it by the book. And as a result, play it very, very discreetly in that regard. That, though, speaks to, I think, a challenge that emanates from this that, again, is not a particularly satisfactory process for any of the parties involved. But then again, you'd hardly believe that it would, even with a structured, more deliberate kind of approach to protests. Nonetheless, that still will result in someone being very happy with the result and someone else being totally displeased with it. You don't get away from that proposition. So as a result, there's almost no way that that's going to be mitigated as you go forward, and we should never be surprised to see that as a consequence as well. But what it has done that's less apparent, just in terms of the time frame, is the indirect effect that Andrew referred to that I think is really quite profound. It has influenced the department's behavior, certainly the public service focus to this in a way to assure that level of equity, to find mechanisms and approaches, remove ambiguity that would otherwise lend itself to an opportunity for protest that would then motivate or prompt an overturn of that decision. And that's becoming more and more evident over time, and the determination on the part of acquisition, not only policy, but also the program structure is an attempt to drive that down. Now, again, this shouldn't be particularly surprising either, given the relatively small number of large-scale programs that are under competitive opportunity. So as a result, many companies, primes and what we're referring to largely, are looking at the opportunities as this is betting the company or coming close to it. Otherwise, you're looking at an alternative future where your company needs to go if you don't win. So the opportunity to make sure that it is the most fulsome competitive arrangement is not just in order to improve your overall market opportunities. It is sometimes the difference between whether you stay in that market frame or get out of it. And that's a stark contrast that is presented more and more frequently, given the necking down of the size of programs, the frequency of them, as well as the choices. within the industrial capacity of those who could actually qualify to do some of these. So as a consequence, it has had that result on the part of the department that I completely agree with Andrew, has been a very evident circumstance. And I would draw the linkage even more directly to the flirting with, if you will, the LPTA approach to looking at contracting mechanisms here as a mechanism to drive down the ambiguity. Just establish it as here's the lowest level of performance it needs to have. Everybody's got to meet this minimum, and after that, it's all about price. And it takes a lot of the ambiguity out of the interpretation. Either you did or you didn't. Either it qualified and you met the grade, and there's your qualification, and if thereafter there are two comparable proposals, either one of which, being qualified, if the low number is there, there it is. It makes the contracting procedure that much more straightforward on the award end, not necessarily on the implementation end, not necessarily on the administration of that contract over all the years it will take to conduct, but it makes the front end of the process much cleaner to the contracting officer, to the acquisition officials, and indeed to the industry. In many respects, if you enter into it knowing those rules, then the proposition is there. But what's also another effect, and I would offer as an augment or supplement to Andrew's otherwise, I think, very thorough summary and discussion of just general impact, is it has motivated industry to do some rather peculiar things as well. Since the enactment of the rules over time, you're seeing a greater frequency, and I admit this is more anecdotal than it is analytical, and derived only from the experience of being in the department as the controller, as the Secretary of the Navy, then seeing the same activities to a lesser degree at NASA and elsewhere, at OMB in the time that I spent there. This is a frequent circumstance where there is not a major program that has come through that I have not gotten a very clear sense, either from the prime contractors involved or in the time that I spent in industry doing this, that there isn't the concurrent, at the same time you're preparing a proposal, a concurrent effort to develop all the documentation necessary to launch a protest in the event you lose. So just the sheer amount of indirect cost, overhead expense, wasted time, frankly, that goes into that effort in anticipation that if I lose, I want to have another shot at this, is frankly what is occurring much more extensively across the industry than probably any other form of behavior. Now, to the lawyers in the room, that's great news. Got lots of Full Employment Act opportunities out of that, there's no doubt about it. But to the standing of really trying to prepare what's the approach, it's occasionally rationalized from what I saw internally as a mechanism to assure that you've thought through all the limitations of what your proposal would present given the contract type that the department may have selected, and trying to figure out exactly how it would be susceptible to either being fully compliant or not sufficiently so. And so as a result, that procedure is part of the equation as well. And inasmuch as I have never participated as an industry executive in a bid protest, every single major contract for which my companies, too, General Electric and later Airbus Group, were involved in, always had in the development of the proposal itself some consideration of what the protest might look like. Never did launch any of them, never did use them as we went forward, but I would suggest that lots of competitors don't have the same view. They particularly intended that this would be an opportunity, notwithstanding whether or not they thought their chances of winning or losing were high or low. It is simply that you've got it prepared, might as well launch it. And part of that is based on necessity. The amount of time you've got from the time of award to the point of protest is pretty short. So as a consequence, if you haven't been thinking about this in advance, you really have lost your opportunity to come back and appeal it, even if you've come to some epiphany later on that somehow the process was really not fair in the approach and the execution. So you have no remedy, so you better be preparing it up front. The process develops that as a mechanism of doing business. And that's part of the overhead we bear as a result of that. And there's no question that that ultimately shows itself in the form of the cost of the activity as well. Final couple of points I would observe too is that the mechanism going forward in terms of how the statement of work, the criteria, the evaluation, so forth, all of that is designed very specifically, again, I think, and thought through from the department standpoint, as a mechanism to really fully justify why each of those variables may be present. And to the extent that they aren't as clear as they need to be, they understand where the vulnerabilities will exist and attempt to put that in place, the safeguards, in order to protect against the protest as well. The mechanism is most useful for the purpose of avoiding misunderstanding or reinterpretation of all that. Is, of course, an opportunity for a lot more dialogue during the course of proposal development. And that, in turn, has the effect of clarifying what the intent is, what the approach that the department may be seeking, in terms of the government may be seeking, in terms of the results of the outcome they're looking for, and assuring that there be no language within the RFP as submitted and sent out that would be open for really drastic reinterpretation or misinterpretation in a way that prompts a bidder to go down the wrong alley on determination of how to do this. That said, that becomes a very structured environment. While dialogue and so forth sounds totally rational, all of us would kind of do that, to say, let's make sure we're all on the same page on this. It nonetheless becomes part of the process as well. And so as a consequence, it is a very structured debate. Indeed, as a mechanism to avoid any misinterpretation, the number of lawyers, again, with all due respect to the profession, outnumber the contracting officers and acquisition officials in the room when these dialogues are underway. And as a result, it is structured purposely to say that there be nothing that could be possibly interpreted, which therefore you're driven more often than not to saying as little as possible. So therefore, you've just defeated the objective of what could be one of the best preventative measures to working through this, because of just the litigious nature of those who feel that they didn't get the fair shot at this or they heard it wrong, want to use that as part of their evidence of the protest as well. So the opportunities there for structuring that differently, holding it harmless, something, anything, just to get human dialogue underway in a more fulsome manner, would be a blow for freedom, I think, in that particular case. Because as it stands, from the point in which the RFP is released, there is the proverbial cone of silence that seems to descend. And you're left to your own devices to figure out exactly what's asked for on the other side of this, which lays the groundwork for exactly these kinds of debates going forward. And I guess the final point of whether or not the level of protests will increase, that's a real speculative prospect. I just don't know. Because again, there's a limited number of opportunities, a limited number of competitive occasions, and it always is part of the structured strategy to develop your recourse on the front end at the same time you're developing your proposal. And that behavior won't stop until such time as there's some dramatic shift in how that ought to be proposed.
Thank you, Sean. Next panelist is Elliott Branch, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Acquisition and Procurement in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, a career, long-serving contracting professional, came out of Naval Sea Systems Command, and I really appreciate you being here, giving us more of a government, currently serving government perspective.
Glad to do that, Andrew. Let me just start out by saying I like the protest process. And I like it because no engineer worth their salt would ever devise a system without a feedback loop. And that's what the protest process is. It's a feedback loop. Now having said that, I think we think about it a whole lot more than we ought to. And let me share with you why. I believe most government contracting officers come to work every day, and they're trying to balance three forces which are sometimes countervailing. And those three forces are efficiency in getting what we are charged to get done, effective solutions on the part of our customers, and integrity of the system. Okay, you've got to have those three things in balance. And if you look at the protest process really only addresses one of those. It addresses the integrity of the system, right? So if you read protest often, as I do, I'm an avid subscriber to the GAO Daybook, so every time one gets issued, I take at least a quick look at it to see what it's about. The words in many of those protest decisions come to mind, right? We will give great deference to the judgment of agency officials, right? So what are they really saying? What they're really saying is there's only about 3 ways you can lose a protest, contracting officer. You just didn't do it right. I mean, you just got it so egregiously wrong from a procedural perspective, you've got to do a do-over. You didn't do what you said you were going to do in sections L and M of the RFP, or to the extent that you entered discussions, you didn't hold meaningful discussions. So contracting officers understand that they can't lose a protest as long as they avoid those 3 traps. And therein lies the problem. So what I think we see, and I'm a lot less concerned than Sean is about the big ones. I'm much more concerned about the smaller ones because those are the ones where contracting officers live every day. So contracting officers pursue strategies to make sure that they don't trip over one of those 3 wires. I'll give you an example. One of my activities that spends a lot of time buying professional services decided to do what I thought was pretty novel. Right? We're now talking about knowledge-based services where the level of experience, the way that experience is harvested, the way those lessons learned are transmitted through an organization really ought to be a key discriminator, you would think, in a proposal, right? What this organization did was they decided the only thing we're going to look at is corporate experience and past performance. And by doing that, they essentially turned what they said was a best value price technical trade-off into a low price technically acceptable competition. When asked about this, they said, well, we believe that writing any kind of a real technical approach is simply an essay exercise and doesn't really give us much insight or provide much value in making a source selection decision. So we just decided to eliminate that. Now, we're off to fix that. But my point to you would be, as they try to balance those 3 forces of efficiency, effectiveness, and integrity, instead of looking at integrity as one of those forces to be balanced, they look at it as a necessary condition or potentially an obstacle to being efficient or effective. So they have essentially designed a system that allows them to be efficient and effective while keeping them away from anybody asking the question about integrity. And the unfortunate part about that is that does not result in a good outcome for the program manager who really needs the knowledge and expertise to come from that. But it took us a long time to find that, right? Because people kept saying you were going low price technically acceptable, and we kept going, no, we're not, until we stumbled across this rather clever way to go low price technically acceptable without going low price technically acceptable. So I would suggest to you that we are, in a sense, talking about the wrong issue in this forum. Because what drives that is an inability, as my boss would tell you, is to get the requirement right. And why does that happen? It happens for a couple of reasons. Number one, we seem to have put up this set of barriers to communication between industry and government over what the requirement ought to be. That's number one. And some of it's our fault because, again, in trying to preserve that system integrity, we say, well, we have to treat everybody equally, so we have to talk to everybody. We don't have a workforce that allows us to talk to everybody. We have to have this entire infrastructure and to make sure that that dialogue takes place in a procedurally proper manner, which is where my friends, the lawyers, come in. So their answer is, don't talk to anyone, okay? On the other hand, industry often comes in, and you know, as a friend of mine says, it's not that you're not good Americans, you're just better capitalists. Your job is to prepare the ground. So you're coming in, and instead of perhaps holding an honest dialogue with us, you're really about the requirement, you're holding a dialogue with us about your solution to the requirement, which may or may not help us. So unless you have a system set up that is designed to collaborate and communicate from the beginning of the time that we have a requirement and industry prepares to bid on that requirement, throughout the process of source selection and contract formation all the way to the end, we will continue to focus on the feedback mechanism, which, if you think about it, is like owning a car and dumping gallons and gallons of oil into it because it smokes instead of just getting your engine fixed. And none of us would do that. So let me suggest that protests have their place. It is an excellent way to administer a system that depends on transparency and integrity. But if we stop at the conversation about protest, we've failed. We really need to have a public dialogue about how government excites demand for the goods and services it needs, how industry is organized to supply that demand, and what business models we construct collaboratively to align supply and demand in the interest of the taxpayer.
Well, thank you, Elliott. And I'm reminded, someone who's not here at the table with us today, but once said to me, after reporting to me that he was going to give a talk and that he was talking immediately after Elliott, that the hardest thing to do is a talk right after Elliott Branch. So, Dick, not only do you get to do that, but you also get to do it after following Sean O'Keefe. So I've set the bar high for you. Next panelist is Dick Ginman, former director of the Defense Acquisition and Procurement Policy. I know I've mangled that. Actually, it's Defense Procurement and Acquisition Policy Office at the Office of AT&L in OSD, but now private citizen Dick Ginman, who's going to give us his, therefore, unadorned thoughts.
So it was probably me that told you that. And I have as a cardinal rule, never follow Elliott in a discussion. So from my perspective, I'll start with the same comment that Elliott started with. I do like protests. From my perspective, the way we do business in the government is different for three reasons. One, we have a requirement to compete. Two, we have a requirement to be transparent. We have to tell you what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, and how we're going to do it. And then third, industry has the right to protest. So from my perspective, what the protest does is it gives us an accountability and a responsibility on the acquisition side, the contracting side. We have an accountability to actually do what it is that we said we were going to do. And then we have a responsibility to in fact, do what it is that we said we were going to do. I'm going to add a little to what Elliott said on why we lose protests. I've always said we lose protests for three reasons. Two of which I guess are an adds to Elliott's three. First, we simply didn't do what we said we were going to do. It's that simple. We write it down, we just simply didn't do what we said we were going to do. And then we lose. The second reason is we didn't write down what we did. All right? And it's interesting to me that from a GAO perspective, anything, and I think the phrase that the lawyers use is contemporaneous documentation, anything that we say we did after the date of the protest, by and large, GAO doesn't believe. So it's a huge effort to get the acquisition team to write down what it is that they did. We do very well in protests if one, we did what we said we were going to do, two, if we wrote it down. The third, and this is rare, but you see it every once in a while, is we were unreasonable in the decision. And I mean, I've read, like Elliott, I've read a lot of protests, and they're rare, but every once in a while you get one where GAO says that's just not a reasonable decision. I love the LPTA discussion, and I just can't resist. For my entire career, the only reason I ever saw the acquisition team, and I'm careful, I'm going to say acquisition team as opposed to contracting officer, because from my perspective, the contracting officer has always been a member of the acquisition team. It is the program manager who leads it and drives it. And at the end of the day, the only thing that I have ever seen that team attempt to do is to deliver the weapon system that met the warfighter's needs. Most of the time, the issues that we had when we failed to do that was because the requirement wasn't written well. We had not spent the time to the communication with industry. We had not spent enough time in the market research up front to ensure that we actually had the requirement written well. When we get into the LPTA discussion, I have yet to read in the knowledge-based services world a performance work statement that had an output metric. And generally, in a competitive mode, we give extra value when you exceed threshold requirement. If there is no objective requirement and there is no way to measure value beyond that, it's hard for me to understand how I then value performance beyond the threshold. Since we're here for protests, I won't go beyond that. I do think, it's not think, it's just those. I have never seen an ACT strategy put together with a thought process of, gee whiz, let's make this protest proof. I have never seen an ACT strategy put together with a thought process of how are we going to avoid a protest. I have only ever seen ACT strategies put together with how is it that we are going to deliver the weapon system that meets the warfighter's needs. It may be that I was in the wrong places, in the wrong businesses, but I've just not seen that. I think it will be a mistake to tinker much with protests. Do I think people have taken advantage of it? Yes, I do. I won't tell you which ones, but I've been involved with a couple of protests that we were probably on protest 4 in one and 5 in another before we finally actually managed to get to award because the incumbent simply protested. And then there's at least one company that I'm familiar with, I believe Elliott is familiar with as well, that I think files a protest every week. With all of the protests filed over the last 4 or 5 years, I think one was sustained by GAO. And it's a little over the top. Would it be nice to do that? Yeah, I'm not worried about frivolous protests. I just don't think out of the protests that we get that they're there. And I think the value that the protest process gives us, to Elliott's perspective, the feedback loop, just provides significant value to the contracting officer, to the acquisition team, to ensure that we have thought through up front what it is that we want to do, how we want to do it, how do we deliver the weapon system, and then to do what we say we do and to write down what we did.
Thank you, Dick. And last but not least on our panel, an actual bid protest litigator.
I'm feeling pretty lonely right now.
Jason J. Carey joins us. He is with a partner at Covington and Burling. Represents clients in litigation with the government, other private parties, including bid protest, and has worked several. Without further ado, Jay, your thoughts?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I guess let me say, yes, I am a protest lawyer, but of course that means representing both protesters when they decide to challenge an award, and also the awardee in defending awards. So, you know, that kind of gives us both perspectives on the process. I'd like to run through just a couple of slides here. And
we always encourage slides here at CSI.
Yeah. And I think Elliott made a great point about the feedback loop. And if we could go to the first slide. The protest process fundamentally tries to balance two competing goals. One is driving accountability, the feedback loop. The other one is trying to do that in a way that does not unduly delay or disrupt the procurement process. And that's a delicate, difficult balance to strike. On the accountability side, we have a highly developed set of procurement rules that are designed to produce sound procurements that maximize value to the government and that ensure fairness to the bidders. And all three of those considerations are intertwined with each other. But in order for the rules to really matter, you have to have a way to drive accountability, and that's really what protests do. I have 2 young kids. I fold a lot of laundry. A while back, I realized that every single article of child laundry I was folding was inside out. So I made a rule, I said, kids, you have to turn, before you put anything in the hamper, it's got to be right side out. And, they're good kids. They nodded. They said, yep, Dad, we'll do that. And next week, I had a basket full of inside out laundry. So the solution was to, I had them come, and I had them turn all the laundry right side out. And as soon as they had to fix their own error, that's what motivated them to avoid the error in the future. And that's fundamentally what protests do. So there are benefits not only to offerors, but also I think, key to emphasize that there are benefits to the government in running stronger procurements. On the delay and disruption side, of course, the government needs to be able to move forward with procuring what it needs when it needs it. And the system is designed with significant protections to ensure that happens. Protesters have to file protests within 10 days and oftentimes even within 5 days of when they learn the basis to protest. They have to move fast. Once the protest is filed, GAO has to decide it in 100 days, of course. And we live in an age when complex litigation takes 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Yet the bomber protest, one of the biggest, most complex procurements ever, was just litigated in 100 days. And of course, we also have mechanisms that make sure the government can continue to get what it needs during the protest. Agencies can issue bridge contracts for services. And of course, if an agency determines that it really needs to move forward with the contract, it can execute an override decision, and it can do that. So there's a fine balance there between the accountability function and protecting against undue delay and disruption. I think recently, in recent years, there's been an increase in protests, and I think that's generated a lot of discussion about whether there are too many. If we could go to the next slide. Looking back historically, I think it's important not to look just at the last 8 years, but to take a longer view. And if we could actually go to the next one. So what does this slide show? This slide shows the number of protests docketed at GAO each year in the years indicated. One comment about this is the number of protests. It's not the number of protested procurements. There are many procurements that will trigger several protests. And it's hard to figure out how many procurements are protested, but taking a rough cut at the last couple of years, it looks like it's about 1,600 or 1,700 procurements a year. And a couple of years ago, Professor Dan Gordon looked at this and concluded that less than 1%, or about 1% or less of all procurements are protested. So it's important to put that in context, that these numbers actually kind of potentially overstate the impact of protests on the system. Just a couple other comments on this. I mean, if you look at the overall numbers, although they have been increasing in recent years, they're still lower than they were from 85 through 93, and they're not terribly high by historical standards. The other comment I'll make is the dip you see in the middle. And it's important to keep a couple of dates in mind. In 1994, Congress passed the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, which radically reduced the ability to protest orders under multiple award contracts. And you see that right around 94, the number of protests starts to plummet. And then you fast forward to 2008, late 2007, 2008, when Congress passes the National Defense Authorization Act, reinstitutes the ability to protest task and delivery orders over 10 million. And that's really when you see the increase, the start of the recent increase in protests. And I'll also note, it looks like maybe it's starting to level off. These numbers, though, don't really tell the whole story because, of course, in this period of time, the federal procurement budget has been growing substantially, right? So if we go to the next slide, this considers how many protests there are for every $1 billion spent on contracts. So this is just the procurement budget, and you see in the late 80s and early 90s, the rate of protest was much higher than it is now. Now, this is not inflation adjusted. If we go to the next slide, the green line is inflation adjusted. It's 2015 dollars. And even once you account for inflation, you can see that the rate of protest at this point is not, again, not high by historical standards. So, I think sometimes we all get the sense that we're awash in protests because they are increasing. But I think this perhaps puts it in perspective, and I think part of the reason that protests get such attention is because they are such highly visible events. And that's in contrast to much of the acquisition process, which is really not visible outside the government. I mean, for any procurement of substantial complexity, there is a long acquisition process that precedes even the issuance of the RFP. And then there can be a substantial proposal process that precedes award. But that process tends not to be visible. So let's talk a little bit more about the accountability and oversight function. Are protests accomplishing that important function? If we could go forward, actually, to the next slide. So this is the sustain rate. This is the number of protests that GAO decides on the merits every year. GAO sustains, in the last year, 2015, sustained 12%. Sustained 68 protests out of a total of 577 that went to decision. And, some people might say, well, doesn't all that blue reflect that there are a lot of protests that don't need to be filed? And I don't think that's the case. I think that's reflective of the deferential standard of review that Dick talked about. And I also think this isn't really the right picture to be looking at. If we go to the next picture, this shows all protests resolved by GAO last year, not just the ones that went to a decision on the merits. And if you look at, on the left-hand side there were 1,123 protests where the agency took corrective action. And that means the agency, in some sense, agreed with the protester that there was an error and voluntarily decided to fix it without waiting for a decision by GAO. And if you combine that those 1,100 cases with the 68 sustains, you get what's known as the effectiveness rate, which is 45%. And the fact that 45% of protests identify an error that someone decides needs to be fixed, I think tells us that protesters are doing a pretty good job of deciding when a protest is appropriate. That's not to say that there aren't some protests where an incumbent wants to keep a contract for 3 months. I think it's more to say that is the exception rather than the rule. If we go to the next slide, this just shows the historical trend with sustain rate and effectiveness rate. And the only point I'll make here is you can see that the 45% effectiveness rate from last year is not a one-off. It's part of a lengthy trend. So for some time now, protests have been doing a pretty good job of identifying when there's a problem that needs to be fixed. If we can turn now to delay and disruption. How much delay and disruption do protests cause? Are they keeping the government from getting what it needs when it needs it? And I think to understand that, you need to look at the place of protests in the overall acquisition system. And I agree with Elliott's point that I think many times people focus too much on the protest, where it would be much more high value to focus on the acquisition process and how we can improve that. If we go to the next slide. So this slide takes 3 procurements and tries to show, is sort of the best I could do based on publicly available information, the whole life cycle of the procurement and where the protest fits in. So for JLTV, for example, the acquisition planning started, I believe, in 2006. And, in fairness, it's gone through several cycles in getting to where we are now. But if you think about this protest, the recent protest, as kind of the last step in the process and a highly visible step, it's important to recognize that that is less than 4% of the amount of effort and the process that was necessary to get us to an award. And in each of these cases, the protest is less than 4% of the timeline. So if we're worried about delay and disruption, it isn't really the protests that I think are at issue. It's, the acquisition process takes a very long time, and if our goal is speeding up the acquisition process, then I think we focus elsewhere besides the protests. The other thing I'll note there is the KCX tanker protest. The corrective action there was quite lengthy, and that was reflective of some errors that GAO found. And so the other way to speed up the process is to run the process in a way that avoids errors. So if we go to the next slide. So how can we improve the system? I agree with the earlier comments. I think it's critical that we support the acquisition workforce. We're losing experienced acquisition personnel at a time that the complexity of procurements is increasing, and I think that's a recipe for more errors. So the acquisition workforce needs support and rebuilding. I think it's also important to focus on the procurement and not the protest, as Elliott said. Just briefly commenting on LPTA, I think LPTA has all sorts of unintended consequences. I mean, it's absolutely true that the use of LPTA makes it more difficult to protest. But the real effect of LPTA, in my view, is inside the government, because it shifts the discretion from the source selection authority at the end of the process to whoever is writing the requirements at the front end of the process. And I have certainly seen situations where the government has run an LPTA procurement, and it gets to the end of the procurement, and it really doesn't like the low price offeror. And then the source selection authority is in a bind. He or she has no discretion. And I think sometimes that leads to worse results for the government, because if there's a better proposal and they decide they want the better proposal, they can't take it. I think sometimes it also leads to rejection of proposals that maybe are technically acceptable because the government really doesn't want that proposal. And then if that happens, you've got to protest because the government hasn't done what it said it would do. So the bottom line here is avoiding protests can itself lead to protests. And I think you got to be very careful about that and very careful about unintended consequences. The final comment I'll make is on communication. And again, I fully agree with the comments that Elliott and others have made. I think communication is critical. If you want to reduce protests, communication is critical. And it's critical at 2 points. It's critical in discussions. Oftentimes, discussions can be very adversarial, and I recognize there can be different reasons why that's the case. But from the contractor's perspective, the offeror's perspective, I will tell you that they get very frustrated because the agency will make these often oracular statements about the agency's concern. And the offeror is sort of left to read the tea leaves about, what is really the problem. Whereas if the acquisition team could be more transparent about the concern, the offeror would be less frustrated and the government would get a better revised proposal and have a more competitive award. And the oracular nature can also lead to a protest if something wasn't clearly communicated. The other point at which communication is critical is the debriefing. After an offeror finds out that they have lost, they meet with the agency to understand why. And those meetings can be very strained and adversarial. You have an offeror who's just spent millions of dollars preparing a proposal. who has spent a year or more going through the proposal process, and they walk into the meeting, and you have an agency which is worried about a protest and does not want to say anything and won't share any information because they're worried about a protest. But the unintended consequence of that is that the offeror walks out of that meeting incredibly frustrated and feeling like they've been stonewalled and feeling like they have no option. There's no way to find out what happened but to protest. And so if agencies can share, I know it's counterintuitive, but if agencies can share more information at a debriefing, I think that will lower the rate of protests. And I'll give you one empirical data point to go along with that. After the tanker protests, the Air Force, kudos to the Air Force, took a hard look at their acquisition process and their protest process. And one of the things they did was institute what they call their extended debriefing program. They only do it for certain procurements where they get a signal from the offeror that they're concerned and there may be a protest. And when that happens, the agency will hold open the debriefing and will give the offeror extensive information about why they did what they did and how they got to the decision they got to. A couple of years ago, I went through that process, and Bain Kelly, who was running the process at the time, shared with me that at that time, the Air Force had done it 41 times. And of the 41 times, 38 times, the disappointed offeror had gone home, had agreed that the agency had done things properly, and did not protest. The other 3 times, the disappointed offeror convinced the Air Force that there was a problem. But in not one of the 41 cases was there a protest. And I think that's emblematic of the power of communication here.
All right, thank you, Jay. Although I can't resist but saying, in the 38 cases, I wonder if they left convinced the Air Force had done the right thing, or they just left convinced that they weren't going to win a protest. But I'll let your framing of it stand. Thank you very much. It was a great set of thoughts from all of you. I want to probe a little deeper on a couple of the themes that came up. And this has been really useful because I think the discussion about the bid protest mechanism as a feedback mechanism is a really good way to think about it. That's not a framing I thought of. I was also really intrigued by what I'm going to call Sean's comments about the guns of August effect, that after industry has gone to all the trouble to game out the protest, when the Archduke is shot in Sarajevo and you lose the contract award, the temptation to launch on the plan is apparently very strong. What I would, you each mostly basically offered an assessment about whether you thought the bid protest mechanism was worthwhile and was essentially working. I'm going to push what some of you said a little bit to essentially say, several of you said it's working. And what I would like to kind of ask is to dig into that a little bit and, thinking of it as a cost-benefit analysis, you could come to that decision for a few different reasons. You could decide that the costs are low and they're exceeded by the benefits, or they're exceeded by the benefits. You could decide that the benefits are really high, and so the costs are worth it. And you could also just decide that you don't see any way to fix it, and so to some extent, irregardless of the cost-benefit analysis, don't mess with it. So I would kind of like each of you to maybe address that. Is the assessment that you made because you think that the benefits vastly outweigh the costs, a little bit outweigh the costs, or is it just that there's no clear way to fix it? Because I think almost everyone identified some problems and also some benefits.
I think from a procedural standpoint, I do not disagree with the assessment of other colleagues here on the panel. This is a process that is pretty clear. It's straightforward. The remedy is as follows, and if you follow this particular procedure, you've got a shot at having it overturned. And that works reasonably well. And whether or not it's too long or too short, or too many or too little, that's a different debate. And whether or not it has motivated different behavior, I think is a larger question. But the most difficult problem, I think that a couple of colleagues here observed that I think is spot on, is shifting of responsibility from the procedural evaluation of the acquisition officials, and I think that's the appropriate term to use that as a much more broad definition, program manager acquisition for the program, as well as the contracting officers, et cetera, interpretation of how the rules ought to be promulgated, and yet when remedy is resolved, coming back with a determination that the source of the problem is the requirement. I think on the KCX tanker effort that was referred to at the end here, that was an example of where the requirement was shifted, even though the basis of the protest itself was over procedural activities conducted by the government that failed to follow through and do what they said, which was didn't meet, didn't explain, didn't describe, et cetera. And so the protest on that one was sustained on procedural grounds, and the remedy the department came back with was to change the requirement. Shifted it from a determination of how much fuel can you offload at range, at maximum capacity that you could envision and support, and shifted it to everybody who steps over the high bar of the current performance of a KC 135 is an acceptable proposal, and price will be the determinant thereafter. That's a huge gulf. It basically says any amount of improvement that you may see is acknowledged but not rewarded. Thank you very much for submitting that on behalf of whatever. But there is no basis of evaluation that would award that higher. And the results came out the way they did precisely for that purpose, even though the reason everybody got to the table was because of procedural process fouls asserted by the aggrieved, who then in turn successfully had the matter overturned and the entirety of the program revamped. That's a problem. And that's a real issue, because that fundamentally is using this mechanism for purposes entirely separate from what was intended to, I think, accurately stated by colleagues here, to preserve the integrity, assure fairness, and provide an equitable remedy to the extent you feel as though that wasn't followed right. That was a big reinterpretation of the process.
So I'm a little uncomfortable with the casting of this as a cost-benefit analysis. And it's because I have a fundamental belief that what the federal government basically does is one of four things, right? So it either provides a safety net for the society as a whole. It provides the infrastructure for a free market economy to function, right? So you have trade, you have certain safety functions, and so forth. It does the treasury functions of financing, you know, the body corporate, and it buys insurance. And I'm in the insurance business. I mean, if you think about it, we really never want to send anybody into harm's way. We always say we build those forces to deter, and if necessary, fight, then win. So when I look at the protest process and the way we accomplish those four functions through contract as opposed to direct government employees, I guess my model is, do the American people demonstrate public support for those things? And I would submit to you that they only support those things if they have a reasonable level of insurance that we're spending those dollars responsibly and transparency. So from that perspective, I would argue that the protest process works, because we're still getting the dollars to support national defense and the things that we need to be a democracy. And that to kind of boil it down to the transaction cost view that an economist would take is a very, very dangerous path in this kind of discussion.
You've outed me as a trained economist.
So if I were going to do it on a cost-benefit analysis, I would eliminate every law for every social program we have. It's not to our benefit to do that, and we would get our products cheaper. I think to Elliott's point, I mean, it is the government. I'll go back to, we have a responsibility, to be transparent in how we do it, and we have a responsibility to be accountable to do it. And I think the protest process provides that to us. It's the feedback loop that Elliott talked to. So do I think it's worth it? Yeah. And if you just do the numbers, DOD does over 10 million transactions a year. I think Jay said 1%, and I think Dan Gordon, when he did that analysis, it was probably about 1. I mean, I think it's actually less than that. If you do the math, the DOD is at Six Sigma. If you do it by transactions, if you do it by dollars, you get a different story, because the protests tend to be on the really, really large dollars. But yeah, I think the protest process is worth it. I don't know that I want to put a value on it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with that as well, but, and I do think it's a delicate balance. You know, I think there are significant hurdles to protesting that we've put up already appropriately to limit the delay and disruption, and I think to the extent you make those hurdles greater to try to, you know, cut back on unmeritorious or frivolous protests, you're going to start losing some of the important accountability function. I think that's an obvious, you know, yin and yang that's going to happen, and so I think the higher value approach is to, you know, look at the incentives that protests create for both offerors and the government, and look at some of the unhelpful way in which offerors and the government are reacting and responding to protests, and try to realign and focus on running a proper procurement rather than avoiding a protest.
Well, thank you. I've got a slew of other questions, but we've got only about 20 minutes left, so I want to open up to the audience, and hopefully they'll ask the really smart questions they usually do. So why don't we start here in the front row?
My name is Bill Montalto. Like Sean and you, I spent 14 years on the Senate side and 14 years on the House side. I was integral in the enactment of both SECA in '84 and FASA in '94. And we, for all the reasons that were so well stated by Mr. Branch and Ms. Ginman, that is exactly what we were trying to do, make sure of the integrity and giving people a chance. But the other thing we did along the way is, I remember writing a provision. I think in the end, Sean, it only applied to small business. There had to be a debriefing. So let's try to get the thing resolved before we have litigation. Then we also next put the focus on agency protests. Let the agency try to do it. And then in the last resort, we did the GAO. And there was a lot of blood in '84 over that, an enormous amount of blood. The agencies were not as enlightened when you two gentlemen were there. They fought it fiercely. But for all the reasons we wrote in, procedures and times, shortness. Dr. Kelman and I got into it in '94 when he went to IDIQ contracts as the way, and then took away the bid protest mechanism. But we also did another thing. We got rid of the courts as yet another forum, which made it harder for the government. And I guess, Andrew, we can never forget that we have our problems with the workforce because the House of Representatives, House Armed Services Committee had arbitrary 5% cuts year after year, and he was not there, so.
Well, I was there for part of it, but not all of it.
Yeah, year after year after year, mindlessly. I was only peripherally involved, but anyway, but the chairman, the chairman was very, very strongly had his feelings. But I guess to put it as the 3-tier, doesn't it make sense? Try to resolve it initially during the debriefing, try to resolve it at the agency level, and then Sean hit upon the most important thing. The big protests are all because everything's become, we bet the company. Okay, we are getting to the point where Norm Augustine, where the entire defense budget goes into one airplane situation. But when we did it in '84, there were millions and millions of transactions, most of them with small businesses, most of them small dollar value. And those are the people we were trying to give some sense. And we cannot forget, we were in the middle of the spare parts wars. And contrary to what John said, yes, it was on the front page of the Post.
Well, you've raised two really good issues that I want to get at least some of the panel to respond to. Not all of you necessarily need to respond. But one is the tiering, and I would point out that we haven't really talked about Court of Federal Claims yet. Maybe worth talking about that role, because although the statistics that Jay showed were all GAO protests, but there are other protest avenues as identified. And then the other issue is the decision that the Congress made, and here you can at least partially blame me, to reapply the protest mechanism to task and delivery orders, and whether the way in which that was done and is operating makes sense. So anyone on the panel who has a thought on those?
So I'll skip the Court of Federal Claims question, but on the task orders, but boy, I think the reaction that we had in the government with the IDIQ contracts was, whoa, let's move everything to IDIQ because you can't protest. And I think Congress was right when they put in the $10 million, and frankly, I'm not sure that it wouldn't be right to just say you can protest all the way. Underlying this whole thing from my standpoint is I do things called peer reviews on major competitive procurements, and one of the clear lessons learned is that I use is don't keep contractors in the dark. We don't communicate enough, and we don't communicate well enough. I think the Jay's point on the Air Force extended debriefing, I'm not sure I wholly agree with it, but I do like the process. But at the end of the day, in the early '90s, when Elliott and I guess we're both at NAVC, we did a look for why the Navy was having significantly more protests than the Air Force and the Army, and our general conclusion was, when we looked at it, the Navy's normal solution to a debriefing was, you lost, what else do you want to know? And as a result, we went in, we put out guidance to significantly increase what you were going to tell contractors. OSD is actually in their source selection guide. It's got a whole chapter on debriefings and what you're expected to do and the encouragements there. Now, whether in execution it gets done is a different issue, but the policy is there is to not keep contractors in the dark.
I'll just add, though, I think part of the barrier is it's not only what you say, but how you say it. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where the protest system perhaps puts a damper on that communication at the time of debrief, because, I now know that's a possibility. So I've got a bunch of lawyers looking over my shoulder now wanting to frame how I give you that information. And sometimes I believe that resorts in protests, or rather debriefings that are less than satisfying. So then you say, well, you really didn't tell me what I wanted to know, so I really have to go further. So it's not only an issue of, putting policy in place that says to contracting officers, you've got to disclose this, but we also need to get enough trust going so it's disclosed. I think fulsome is a great word for that. There has to be a fulsome explanation as to what we did and why we did it.
And just one comment responding to that. I mean, I fully agree with that. And although I think it's not just how the message is delivered is part of the issue, but I also think part of the issue is a shutting down and a refusal to answer questions beyond a certain point. So, for example, if an offeror has a question about how the price evaluation was done, the offeror might have some detailed questions about that, which the agency under the regulations doesn't necessarily need to answer. And often when an agency gets some probing questions about how they did an analysis, the contracting officer will just say, we're not answering that, we're not getting into that. And that's where you kind of get this stonewalling, presentation, even though that may not be what it really is. With respect to the tiered protests, if you go down that road, the downside is that extends the process, right? And there is an ability at this point to start with the agency and then go to GAO, but there are some procedural reasons why that doesn't work so well, because as the protester, you can lose the stay. And you also don't get a lot of, with the exception of the Air Force program, a lot of information through an agency protest, so you don't really understand what happened. With respect to the Court of Federal Claims, there are, of course, protests at the court, but I think there's only, in the last several years, it's been 80, maybe 90 protests a year. So it's a far, far lower number. And those protests tend to be a mix of what are called reverse protests, where the protester has won at GAO and the awardee, the original awardee, thinks that the GAO decision was irrational and goes to the court to challenge that. They can also be cases where GAO doesn't really have jurisdiction over, for example, the Postal Service or the FDIC. And some of them, I haven't looked at how many, but some of them are second bite protests where, like with JLTV, you had a protester loss at GAO, and then they went to the court. But it's relative to what's going on at GAO, it's such a small universe of cases. Go ahead.
I can't resist offering the notion that maybe one approach to this that really provides the acquisition officials with the opportunity to be absolutely blunt with what's going on and avoid any other issue or assertion or anything thereafter, and removes the prospect that that then in turn will become the basis of further protest argument, is if the ground rules for a post-award meeting debrief on the result were that, I'm sorry, lawyers, no lawyer be permitted in the room, and that the conversation may not be attributable for the purpose of a future protest or determination. Period. Just come in and tell me why it is I lost. That gets past the first issue that Dick said. Culturally, the department has gone through all of the changes to do of getting past the notion of saying, you lost, so what else you want to know? And instead say, look, here's the reasons why. This is exactly how we looked at it. And on that basis, that doesn't remove the contractor's ability, even after that session's over, from then filing the protest, but may not attribute that insight, that discussion, as a mechanism, a means, a reason why it is they feel like they're aggrieved. They either had the basis when they looked at the process issues as being not followed properly, or there was some other egregious determination. But if this goes on as an endless litigious process, it won't conclude with anything other than the folks. You're never going to be happy when you leave those meetings with a clear understanding of why you lost. But it certainly will mitigate the emotion and the likelihood that you're going to come back with something that says, there was something they weren't telling me. And so we're going to go ahead and file it and see if we can get it through the discovery process. That eliminates all of it.
Let's pick up another question. I thought I saw a hand. Okay. Here.
Good morning. I'm Rob Riley. I'm a retired naval officer. From 2006 to 2009, I was head of a contracting activity, the Military Sea Lift Command. Since that time, I retired in 2010, and I've been out in business, in industry, working to support principally what I would call tier two companies, not the large ones that are involved in multi-year procurements, but the ones that navigate and live in that service environment, and also in the introduction of new technology that they're looking for a marketplace. To Mr. Carey's slide, when you put up the trends over time in terms of protests, and to speak to Mr. Branch's comments about indirect costs, one of the things I was struck with was what the military was doing at that time, and how that has increased the level of contracting activity. Yeah, and it was mentioned in '94 there was some acquisition reform that was instituted. Hearkening back to the buildup and our going to war in the Gulf War time, and then ramping down, And then in 2001, once again, going out in the field with the sense of urgency with contracting, we started to spike back up. And then also looking at the 2009, 10, 11, 12 frame, when we experienced multiple CR years and sequestration, which then makes it difficult understanding what the government's actual requirement is. I was wondering if some of those trends that you observed kind of spoke to those kind of dynamics. Business expanding to support the mission and there being more business, and then when it's time to contract, when the OCO money starts to go away and companies realize that they've grown and now their market opportunities are shrinking, if those are factors as well that you've seen drive the protest, the tempo of protests.
I think that's a great question, and I think it's a very complicated relationship. I don't know if we can put like slide 5 back up. Yeah. So, I mean, to your point, I think the budget certainly has an effect, but if you look at the period between 1985 through about 2001, 2002, in inflation-adjusted terms, federal procurement spending was relatively flat. I mean, it went down at the beginning of that period, and then it was fairly flat for a long time. Yet you have this precipitous drop in the frequency of protests. So there's something else going on there that's driving the drop in protests. And I think that was in part at least, the removal of task order jurisdiction, though certainly there were other things going on as well. And then in 02, 03, you start to have these major increases in the defense budget and in procurement spending. And the graph of procurement spending starts to go up. But the protests are lagging there, and you really don't see them start to tick up until, again, task order jurisdiction is reinstituted. So, but I take your point. I mean, I do think the increase in the budget and the increase in opportunities led to more protests. I mean, that would be a natural relationship. I also think when the commercial economy went down in 2008, that made government business more important. And I think it made companies more willing to explore protests because the government business was more important. And I think now that the federal budget has shrunk, as you say, and there are fewer opportunities, I think that causes companies to take a harder look at it. I don't think, though, that it's a linear relationship with increasing protests, because the fact that they're taking a harder look at it doesn't mean that they're going to protest. And I think something that it's very important to remember is that most contractors, particularly the sophisticated ones, are very wary of suing their customer. I mean, that's how they view a protest. They view it as suing their customer. And they are very hesitant to do that unless they think they have a good reason. And they might file the protest and have their lawyers get into the record and realize, well, we didn't have a good reason, and then they withdraw the protest. But so there's a distinction between, I think the companies are looking harder at it now, but I don't think that translates linearly into more protests.
Okay, can I get over here? Yes, David.
Hi, David Sedney, formerly with the Department of Defense. I have a question about a subset of this discussion, but I think it's an important subset, and I think it maybe goes to a fifth category that Elliott Branch raised. It goes beyond insurance. It's when you're actually fighting a war and people are dying, which doesn't really fit into the four categories. And in the case, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan and Pakistan, worked very closely with Dick and others on a number of issues. And I found that the protest mechanism was really counterproductive to our effective prosecution of the war and our effective advancement of our national security objectives. I guess, Andrew, you don't want us to mention specific contracts, but I think there's a couple that are pretty clear. But one area that I thought was particularly debilitating was the ability of foreign bidders who were not interested in transparency, who came from societies where integrity was not an issue, where the suggestion of political influence that Sean said we were trying to get rid of, where the suggestion of political influence wasn't the issue, political influence was all that mattered, and who then came to Washington, hired, I don't know if it was your particular firm, but hired a lot of very prestigious, very expensive firms and used the protest process to extend their time and their ability to accumulate hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. contracts at profit rates were up to around 50%. So I have a couple of suggestions. One is that nobody should be allowed to use the protest process, or actually in the acquisitions process either, but should be allowed to use the protest process unless you know who they are. A post office box in Gibraltar should not be able to protest a U.S. contract. And secondly, when really high stakes are involved, people are dying because procurement mistakes are being made. Should people be asked to file a bond when they protest? A really tough bond. You know, they forfeit more than they might win in the contract in order to do the protest. In other words, can you put some discipline into the protest process in really important cases such as where we're in conflict? Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for raising two really critical issues, the issue of frivolous protests and something that was mentioned earlier, incumbents trying to hold on to business. So I would really like to get some thoughts from the panel on that problem. I highlighted, in this case, in overseas contracting, and also on possible mechanisms that have been suggested. David suggested one. There have been some others that have been suggested for addressing those situations, whether those might have merit. I'll throw one out there. I kind of take inspiration from, loosely, take inspiration from the NFL, where they have a protest mechanism, right? You can protest a call, and the issue is if you protest and you win, you get another protest. And so the idea being that those who consistently protest and consistently lose eventually reach a limit. I wouldn't put it where the NFL puts it in the case of the defense acquisition system in terms of numbers, but I think you take the point. So I'd be interested to get the panel's reaction on those issues.
So I'll start. And I look at where we've been for the last 40 years. And I think we as a government have missed a really critical shift. Okay, so when we abolished the draft in 1974 and stopped using conscript labor, and we started to have to pay people what the market bore, we started substituting capital for labor. And when we started to do that, we almost welcomed contractors into our midst, so that we got to a point where in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were at a 1-to-1 ratio with service members to contractors. And we never skilled ourselves to manage a national defense apparatus like that. So as we go through this now, and we go through this in what we call OCS, Operational Contract Support, to try to institutionalize the lessons coming out of theater over the last 15 years. The thing that disturbs me most is that our COCOMs still look at this as an issue of the J4's problem. When you think about it, it's the J3's problem, it's the plans, it's the ops guy's problem, it's the 5's problem, it's the future plans problem, it's the personnel's problem, and more importantly, it's the 2, okay, who's the intelligence guy. Because frankly, there are places in the world that I shouldn't even be trying to contract, to your point. But until we get a sense to the COCOMs that this is really commander's business and this is a total staff effort, you will never get at the structural issues you raise. So we can put Band-Aids on it, like performance or protest bonds. And we can look at mechanisms to try to, if you will, screen out from a policy perspective who may protest and who may not. But I would argue, if we're going to run a national security apparatus where we are going to depend on contractors in theater significantly, then the DOD has got to wrap its head around what the composition of warfighting is and who is responsible for that acquisition process, because it ain't contracting officers.
operational contract support, I was there when that was coined, and I have lived to regret it every minute of the day. It should have been operational commanders support, or combat support. Every single time an issue came up, it wasn't just the J4, it was go ask the contracting officer. In its entirety, it's an issue with the requirement, how the requirement's written, and where it's there. David, I mean, part of me says, we've always had the power to move forward when we needed to. When I was head of contracts at AFC, we proceeded in the face of protests 2 or 3 times. You just had to do it with thought. And when I was the director at DPAP, and I think it was in Djibouti, we went forward in the face of a protest. We have the ability to do that. I think at the end of the day, I think the points you raise are really, really good. But we have the ability when we needed to just to go sole source. We had the ability to exclude people. I think the legislation that we got, I generally refer, actually, I won't tell you what I refer to it as. The legislation that allowed us to declare somebody an enemy, so that we could exclude them was an attempt to try to solve some of those problems to get there. I think Elliott's point is well taken. The chairman did a study on where we were really at risk, and it turned out that in every one of his J codes there was a significant reliance on contractors. The logistics one was the one that was over the top, but in the intelligence and the J2 relying on contractors. I mean, I spent a tremendous amount of my time with the OCS efforts, working with the J2, working with the J4, working with the J3, and working with a comptroller, because we had as many issues getting the right color of money on it so that we could move forward to solve problems. So, but I think it would be a mistake to put an insurance bond or some kind of a penalty for protesting on it.
Yeah, and I'll just mention with respect to the override process that allows an agency to move forward with performance. I think that is it's an important part of the process for the exact scenario you described, and it does get used. It was used for the Bliss procurement by the Department of State when that was protested by Fluor and DynCorp and KBR. It was used in the Hawker 3 protest by the Air Force. And it was used by NASA and the commercial crew procurement when that was protested by Sierra Nevada. So there is this mechanism that allows agencies to move forward, and they use it when they conclude that they need to go forward.
Well, thank you to our panel. We've come to the end of our time, and I thank you to our audience for sticking with us. I actually could continue on probably for another couple hours, but in respect for your time, we won't do that. And please join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.